Welcome to the Unexamined Partial. 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 This is our first episode, our debut, or premiere. Basically, no matter what you want to call it, we've decided to appropriately entitle this eponymous episode, Bach is Our Pilot. After all, not only is this title reflective of the fact that this is our first episode, and thus our pilot, but the subject matter for this episode is centered around that big luminary composer of Western classical music, the one, the only, Mr. Johann Sebastian Bach. We, that being the makers of this podcast, had a long discussion about who to start a classical music podcast with. And after some heated debate, we decided that doing our first episode on Bach was a good way to begin.
I think that the choice for Bach was pretty natural from my point of view, because I look at him as the source of inspiration and the building block, the foundation stone for Western music. I think it's difficult to understand and make sense of a lot of what happened in music history and a lot of the development of musical ideas without going back to Bach.
We'll go into our individual reasons for this decision within the content of this particular episode, but for now, I want to take a second to explain the main principles behind this podcast and subsequent podcasts in the future.
And I also feel that he's an enormous inspiration and is a figure that all types of musicians, audiences, music lovers continually go back to. So my interest in choosing Bach was to discuss sort of why that is and why he's such an important figure in music.
Just going to take a second here to introduce my fellow podcasting colleagues, beginning with...
Hi, I'm Justin Christensen, a Vancouver-born, London-based composer and performer.
I'm Emlyn Stam, here in The Hague, the Netherlands. I was originally born and raised in Calgary, and I'm a freelance violist playing quite a bit of chamber and orchestral music and contemporary music.
My name is Graham Flett. I'm a composer. I was born in Canada, and I now live in the Netherlands. I am a composer of contemporary classical music. I play guitar, play some piano. I've got a pretty mixed background of a lot of different influences and experiences in music, and feel like I know some things about classical music and don't know some things, and know some things about other music. And so these podcasts, for me, is a good way of learning and more getting into more detail about the whole field of classical music.
And you used to play in a rock band. You started out in rock music, no?
Well, I started out playing rock music when I was in my teenage years, and which was pretty much always going side by side with also some classical piano playing as well. So those two things were kind of coexisting.
Cool.
Yeah.
I started playing the piano as well, and then went on to play the violin and the viola, and eventually I chose that as my kind of specialization in musical life.
Do you still play piano?
I can still play the piano, but I haven't played piano in public for probably a decade or so now.
I think I've seen you play piano in public in Calgary.
Oh, right.
Almost about 10 years ago.
No, I'm lying. I actually played piano in public as part of a contemporary music concert 2 years ago.
Oh, that is true. I also saw that.
What did you play?
It was part of a big ensemble piece by Henze where the viola player was required to play some piano.
You had to kind of like bang some stuff out, or did you have to play like something hard?
Yeah, I had to mostly bang some stuff up and stuff out of the piano and throw rubber balls on the strings and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, it was spectacular. But anyways, why are you guys interested in doing the podcast?
I think it's a good place to just talk about music and to, in a way, I mean, we have our own perspective on things, and sometimes you sort of think that, I don't know, you're right or you're correct or you know a lot, and then I think these are going to be interesting ways to look at the canon and other issues, and just sort of to dig into them and to learn from each other as well.
I love the idea of sort of exploring a lot of musical material, musical history, and musical culture in a more informal way, not in a non-academic sort of a way, just where we can, talk and explore different ideas and see what we can encounter and learn a lot along the way, and hopefully elucidate a lot of ideas and a lot of open a lot of musical worlds to whoever is interested in listening to our discussions.
For me, it's a question of, I can't even remember this word. This is terrible. That composers were interested in things, that they were interested in actually saying things, whereas now we try and relegate them to the role of entertainment, where we don't want to believe that art has a role. And maybe we can, through looking at these things, not saying that there is one meaning that should be brought out in music, but that there are, instead of no meaning, but that maybe there are multiple meanings that can be read into musical pieces, and that composers were interested in things. They were interested in being a part of their time.
We're making these podcasts because we wanted to shed some light on the gigantic field of classical music. With that said, though, we are approaching each composer or topic we explore through the lens of certain repertoire, and additionally, we are also bringing secondary readings to these discussions. Presently, we're going to cover a number of examples from the Western musical canon, but we're also looking at having episodes on classical music traditions from other parts of the globe. These podcasts are forums where we can speak casually about the composer or the subject in question, and there is an emphasis on presenting information and knowledge in a fairly relaxed and fun manner. All of our readings will be listed on our website, which at the present moment is still a cool idea that's waiting to be realized. However, on this imagined website, we will be posting citations of all the music we have used to exemplify this and other dialogues. This point brings us to one sticky matter of copyright.
In these podcasts, we are sticking to the 2009 regulation that we are allowed to use 30 seconds of musical content for promotional purposes. If we go beyond this duration, we accept that we are privy to share a portion of our vast potential revenues with the musical content we have brought into this show. Although our caveat is that we are not going to be held responsible for any serious disappointment this may cause when any third parties realize how little money they may receive from this process.
Now, some general guidelines structuring our conversations. Number one. We are assuming our audience knows something, but definitely not everything about the subject we've decided to address. For instance, in this episode, we're assuming you've heard of J.S. Bach, and have probably heard his music, and from that you've decided you like it enough to try and listen to a really long podcast where three musicians attempt to sound smart, cool, and funny about this particular composer. On the flip side of this, though, we are also expecting that through the course of our discussions, we will strike upon some facts, anecdotes, and opinions that may illuminate, enlighten, or enrage fellow musical colleagues who are quite familiar with the subject for this and future episodes. Discussion guideline number 2. No gratuitous name dropping. Name dropping can be really annoying, but it is surely going to happen through the course of these podcasts. Luckily, we're taking steps to help our audience understand what is being name dropped through the appearance of short samples. So, when a name drop happens, we'll do our best, in the arduous period of post-production, to elucidate the reference with a nice little audio clip. These audio examples will also be posted and connected to places where the music in question can be listened to, purchased, or studied in some form or another. And our final discussion guideline is our tenet to promote clarity and humor over obscurity. This point is rather self-explanatory, with perhaps the exception being that sometimes obscurity is also funny. And in that case, if obscurity helps with making a point more clear, and also happens to be funny, then it's definitely fair game. To preface this episode, Bach is our pilot. This episode is exactly that, a pilot. We weren't even sure we could technically pull this off, but we decided to take the plunge and record ourselves before we got basically too well rehearsed with the subject. Unfortunately, we did run into some technical hiccups. Most obvious are EQ issues and some basic recording mistakes that we unfortunately didn't manage to avoid on this particular round. In light of this, we ask any listeners of this podcast to bear with us for this premiere, and would like to assure them that these blunders most likely won't happen again. For this episode, we have tackled one of the biggest composers in the canon of Western classical music, And to pad ourselves from the inevitable attacks from our audience, we have cloaked any insecurities we have by outsourcing a lot of the content of our discussion to other secondary sources. We read an essay by John Butt, yes, that is his last name, entitled The Postmodern Mindset, Musicology in the Future of Bach Scholarship, as well as 3 chapters from his larger book, Bach's Dialogue with Modernity, Perspectives on the Passions. And in contrast to the Butt reading, we also looked at an essay by the infamous Teodoro Adorno, where he cheerfully muses upon the big bad J.S. Bach in his 1950s essay entitled Bach, Defended Against His Devotees.
We also looked at an interview with Glenn Gould about the art of fugue.
There are moments in the art of fugue that are much more valuable than its virtuosity, I think. Moments that, for me, absolutely surpass everything else that Bach wrote. I really can't think of any music that moves me more deeply than that last fugue.
But I think we should start off by talking about why we chose to do a first episode on Bach, I think.
So for me, the importance of Bach is that he is this sort of pivotal character, both holding on to the past, both holding on to the Renaissance ideas which moved into the Baroque, but at the same time living at the beginning of the Enlightenment. So Descartes has already died about 50 years before, and his ideas are starting to kind of flow into Germany, where Bach is living.
And his ideas are, in a nutshell, this distinction between the human being as a subject and the objects in the external world, I suppose, are the central concepts.
Very much, yes.
I think, therefore I am.
So I think, therefore I am, is very much focused on the internal, and then that you trust on God for the external. So from before that, there's not so much the sense of subject. With Descartes, he's saying the subject is all, the individual that I am is all that I really have a grasp of. Anything that my senses are taking in, I do not know. And so this is really tied in with the classical music that is starting to take place already within Bach's own life. But more importantly, his music still is pushing this idea of the eternal. You sense an idea that there is a lot more goal-directedness that you would have in the Renaissance, which a lot of the pieces you feel like they just could go on forever, that they just start and stop at any point. The end is helped with the cadence. So you just And
a cadence is, for those who don't know, is a kind of a period at the end of a sentence. It's sort of the basis of Western music, is this idea that there's always a moment of closing at the end of a musical phrase. I just want to take everyone through the basic kind of biographical information. Really quickly, I mean, Bach lived from 1685 to 1750, and he was born in Eisenach, rather central Germany, in a family of musicians. His father was the Kapellmeister, director of music for the town, and he learned harpsichord, violin, organ, clavichord at an early age. His parents died when he was only 10, and he left with his oldest brother. At 14, he got a scholarship to study in Lüneburg, which is the far north of Germany, where he went to a choir school and learned the organ and studied harpsichord further. And after that, he was given a post in Weimar, Arnstadt, several different places. Came into contact with Buxtehude, who was a famous organist and composer at that time. And Bach actually wanted to become Buxtehude's assistant, but the prerequisite for doing that was to marry his daughter. And Bach absolutely wasn't interested in his daughter, so that didn't work out.
It sounds like there's a story there.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. We know quite little about his life, obviously, because he corresponded very little by post, and we have a few sort of indications about his personal life, other than sort of basic records of where he lived and so on and so forth. But I mean, after that time, he moved to Mulhausen, married his first wife, Maria Barbara. He got another post in Weimar, this time as the Kapellmeister, the director of music, and that's where he could really start to compose his own keyboard works and orchestral works, and where the Italian influence from the earlier Italian Baroque composers like Vivaldi and Corelli came into his music. You know, this concerto ideas where you have a solo instrument alternating with a full group of players, a full orchestra of players. And actually, when he left Weimar, he was first jailed for a month before he was unfavorably discharged. And the reason for that is that he was forcing the issue of his dismissal with his employer. So he wanted to leave, and his employer said, well, you know, I'm going to send you to jail as punishment for wanting to leave your employment.
So this shows, in a way, that he's living in a time that hasn't quite accepted Enlightenment thinking. So this is still feudalist ideas. Like the person who was your employer was in a way your owner. Absolutely.
And I mean, he's starting to move in a more of an independent way as a person, I guess you could say, in his life. And then, so after that, he was appointed Kapellmeister in Köthen to Prince Leopold. His first wife died while he was there. He married his second wife, Anna Magdalena. And a few years later, 1723, he was appointed the cantor at the St. Thomas Church, Thomaskirche in Leipzig, and director of music for the entire city. So he had responsibilities there for overseeing music in 3 churches, teaching music at the university, teaching choirs, training the choir boys, performing cantatas every Sunday. And a few years later, he took over the local Collegium Musicum, which was a society of musically active university students that regularly performed in this Café Zimmermann in Leipzig, and had actually been set up by his colleague Telemann a few years earlier. That sort of gave him a grip over the entire musical life of Leipzig and surroundings. He was sort of the top man in charge of music there. And then he sort of furthered his political connections. For example, he wrote this Mass in B minor for August III, Elector of Saxony, that got him appointed as a royal court composer. And he visited King Frederick of Russia in Potsdam, who asked him to improvise something that resulted in the musical offering. And then he joined this Correspondence Society of Musical Research, which is what he wrote. This group is what he wrote The Art of Fugue for. And they also were the ones who arranged to have his portrait painted and so on. And so it was he made sort of important steps in expanding his reach and his career, sort of, so to speak, at the end of his life. And then 1750, modern researchers assume that he died of a stroke, which was complicated by pneumonia. But I mean, obviously lived to quite a decent age for that time, right?
Was it not also tied to his eye operation, or is this just idle gossip?
That is a story that sort of was perpetrated by his son, but that turns out not to be as likely as the story about the stroke.
Okay.
So I mean, that's sort of basic background on Bach.
And so there's this story about him being jailed for breaking his contract.
Actually, for wanting to leave his employer, basically.
Have you ever heard the other story about him being jailed for slander?
Yes.
For insulting a bassoon player, apparently.
No, I don't know this story.
Yeah, and this is a story a professor of mine dished out. The importance of it is that he had to spend a night or 2 nights in jail or something for slander, apparently, because there was some musician that he didn't play his music well, and he said something to them on the street. And then he went to jail for a night or 2. But he started the book 1 of Preludes and Fugues. So
that he would no longer have to work with bassoon players.
Yeah, but the idea for that work came while he was in jail.
Ich habe eine Idee.
No, it's worse. It is worse than this. Bach pulled a sword on a bassoonist.
Okay. I mean, I think that's why we're looking at Bach. I mean, any composer who pulls a sword on a musician for not playing their pieces well is kind of got some chutzpah. So, you know.
So basically, it was a duel. In his early 20s, Bach pulled a sword on a bassoonist who had accused him of slander. So yes. So Bach had been talking about, probably saying horrible things about this bassoonist who had performed his piece terribly.
Yeah. I wonder what piece it was, but anyway, we could find that. But yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think the reason why we're looking at Bach is because it's pretty hard to avoid.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I sort of spoke with you guys about if Western music could be represented as a totem pole, you know, Bach's head would be up there at probably like the top, wherever the eagle would be or something like that in Haydn mythology or whatever. But it's, you know, I think we still see Bach in that way, especially when you study classical music. It's really, for a long time, it seemed like music history began with Bach.
So in a way, I almost see it more that he's at the bottom. So you don't see the part of the totem pole that is underneath the ground.
But it's actually the more important things are actually at the top. And
I know.
We're getting our mythologies confused here.
Yes. Because there are a lot of things that are underneath him that he, of course, incorporated a lot of other composers into his style.
Yeah, but I think they're marginalized now to such an extent that whatever is before Bach is irrelevant almost. And I mean, I don't believe that, but I think it's actually kind of that's the kind of narrative that we encounter, is that, well, whatever before Bach is not so important, especially in North America. I don't know. Europe, they sort of seem to have more of like, oh, well, you know, check out Froberger or something like that, you know, like, but...
Who's Froberger?
Froberger's cool. But anyway...
And maybe we should explain a little bit about that, because I mean, we're coming sort of into this thesis that he's on the cusp of the modern, right? You mentioned Descartes and this growing kind of humanism in European society in the 17th, 18th century. And on the one hand, you're looking back towards the Middle Ages and towards the Renaissance and this idea of music as being like subservient to God and to the church, or towards some sort of text and having some sort of concrete meaning or expression of God's will. And on the other side, you're looking forward towards this idea of musical classicism, which is developing, and this idea of the galant style, as it's called, which was taken up by Bach's sons, Johann Friedman, for example, and Carl Philipp Emanuel to a large extent. That music should be entertaining, and it should have diversity of emotions, and it should have a clear, melodious figuration you can follow with a nice accompaniment, and it should be very, you know, diverting in that sense. And he's sort of situated in between these two spheres of thought in music.
Also, they were in the start of the classical period. They were attempting to return to nature. They considered the Baroque styles and the kind of ornamentation that they would add to everything to be against nature.
Well, you can kind of see their point in a way. Like, I mean, if you spent 70 years in that style.
I think this is a good segue into the Goldberg Variations, because if we look at the Goldbergs, what do we see? Well, we see a kind of unity of, there's a unity of the work through the fact that there's this ground bass line, these same bass notes with the same harmonies above them, which set the structure for all the variations that come after. And then when we look at the variations, you find you find some very straightforward, sort of almost more classical, let's say galant style music, as well as these incredibly intriguing canonic counterpoint things where the one, you know, like a canon, like in that, Frère Jacques or whatever, where the one voice exactly copies the other. I mean, that's what a canon is. He writes these canons at all kinds of different intervals, separated in an extraordinarily complicated and contrapuntal way, that you see both these styles coming together in the same piece, as well as these influences. Like there's the French overture. Or you have these very Italian sort of virtuosic piano bits.
Yeah, Bach is like a fusion composer. I mean, we kind of hear, I think, stylistically, there's the difference between French and Italian is somewhat neutralized to our ears now, but I think back then it was a lot more present. And I mean, this is one of the critiques that came up. I think, Justin, this German fellow, Scheib or Scheib, whatever.
Scheibe.
I know.
It's not Holland, for goodness sake.
How would you say it, Emmeline, again?
Scheibe.
Scheibe's point was what he was too influenced by the Italian school, and that this is kind of, I mean, you can sort of see this critique against Bach's work being also quite nationalistic in the time, but I think these kind of lenses into Bach's music are sort of lost on us now.
I don't know if they're lost on us, because you can point them out quite clearly in the Goldberg Variations. So I don't agree with that. If we just look at the structure, okay, let's talk about the Goldberg Variations. Well, you have this aria, which is a melody at the beginning, with this bass line, as I explained. You have the bass notes, which form the sort of the foundation for the harmony and for everything that the piece is built on. And then, rather than often in variations we're used to a melody that is taken and then there are variations presented upon the melody, in this case he uses basically purely the bass line and the harmony, and having that appear over and over again as the ground structure for the whole thing.
There's 30 variations and 32 movements, including both arias.
So every third variation in the series comes up with a canon. So you take the 30, then every third one is a canon. And then the first one is a unison canon, so it's an exact canon. The second voice plays exactly starting at the same pitch. The second canon that comes is the second voice starts their entry at the interval of a second higher, and so on to third. A fourth. A fifth. Etc. until you reach the ninth. And what you have as well is a very sort of set structure that after every single canon you have a recognizable Baroque form, like a kind of a dance of a particular kind, or a Sicilienne, or a figetta, or a French overture, or there's some sort of Baroque form there. After one of those Baroque forms, what you'll find is one of these type of virtuosic piano movements where there's a lot of hands crossing each other. It's a little bit of what you would call sort of, I don't know, an Italian style or whatever it is.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because I just keep listening to the Goldberg Variations, various different performances of it, and just getting a different sense of the piece. But, I'm actually not an expert on this piece at all, and I'm just kind of listening to it maybe a bit more superficially in that way, that I'm not getting into these musical nuts and bolts that are really happening. I do have to say that at a certain point, it gets kind of G major.
It certainly does.
The whole thing is, of course, in the same key because it has the same harmonies, with the exception of 3 variations which are in the minor key, which are very special moments in the piece. The one is the canon at the 5th, which the last variation in the first part, which sounds to me extremely dramatic, extremely full of some sort of anguish or some different type of expression than what's gone on before. And interesting canon that is, because it's also a canon in inversion, as they say, which means that instead of the second voice coming in and copying the first one exactly, it copies it in the opposite direction. So it's extremely kind of complicated compositional technique, almost mathematical compositional technique. And then you have this long variation in the minor, which I think he's marked adagio in the second part, which is very kind of ornate, developing line on top of this harmony. It's quite spectacular.
I think this is another criticism of Bach, though we could mention, is that he, just to throw in there, is that some people considered him to be a mathematic, he wasn't musical because he would do all these intricate things. And for instance, doing something at the inversion is quite a feat. But perhaps they considered also when they're moving to the classical time where it's more about feelings and immediate feelings, that they would discard this kind of elitism, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. I think this is it is a general criticism of Bach, like that he was a logician / musician who was very adept at putting things backwards and transposing themes up various levels of the scale and making it kind of work out numerically. And I mean, this is even, I think, let's say, I think Bach has definitely, in our present day, Bach has kind of secured his place and his importance in definitely in the academy, definitely outside of the academy. I think like someone like Glenn Gould brought a lot of attention to Bach and sort of in the public sphere, let's say, of general music listening, people are aware of Bach, I believe anyway. And but I mean, if my impression from talking to like someone like my grandmother, who it was an amateur musician playing piano, and she would prefer Liszt. She would prefer to play romantic music, and Bach was just a mathematical kind of puzzle to her that she wasn't interested in, and still doesn't really find the music of Bach that interesting. So that's that generation, and I think
that's a serious exaggeration to say it's that generation, because I think, if we look at the reading, the Butt reading about the dialogues of modernity, what he clearly points out, and which I think really makes a lot of sense to me historically, is that the appreciation of Bach reached its zenith in the 19th century. So there was something about this kind of romanticism and individuality that fostered an unbelievable appreciation for Bach that was not present in the late 18th century.
And my funny question is, of course, how is that suddenly they're hearing these aspects of the music that were obviously there in the original, but the listeners didn't hear it, because it's the same. They're, in a funny way, they're aiming for the same thing in romantic music and in classical music. They're aiming for the individual. They're aiming for, feelings. They just had different means of trying to come up with how to go about what they were doing. If I can defend Bach for a second from your grandmother,
I mean, it's just an example. It just comes to mind of like that impression.
It is.
Way to go! Start off your podcast by slogging your grandmother. That's good, man.
I know. She'll never forgive me.
So I just have a quote from C.P.E. Bach. C.P.E. Bach, because there are very little writings from Bach himself, but C.P.E. Bach did consider writing about music to be quite important. So here he's talking about Bach and this mathematical aspect of himself, but in a very intuitive way. So when Bach listened to a rich and many-voiced fugue, he could soon say, after the first entries of the subjects, what contrapuntal devices it would be possible to apply, and which of them the composer by rights ought to apply. And on such occasions, when I was standing next to him, and he had voiced his surmises to me, he would joyfully nudge me when his expectations were fulfilled.
Just to explain that maybe a little bit. So, I mean, a fugue is where you have several voices which enter one after the other. It's three or more voices, starting with the same theme, the same little musical motive. And one plays the motive, then the second one takes it up, and then the third. Sort of like what you have in a canon, but that bit is preserved for the beginning. And the style of a fugue is that you have this counterpoint, which means you have multiple voices all doing independent and different things at the same time. Polyphony, it's like three people talking at the same time, rather than where you just say, okay, well, this is the melody, this is the song, and this is the harmony that goes under it, which is the accompaniment, which is very ordered and very easy to hear. So what Bach was basically saying is, well, I hear the theme, and I already know the potential and the possibilities that that theme has. And that very much plays into his way, I think, of composing music, where he was always taking a kind of basic material from out of, sometimes it seems like just from out of thin air, like a few notes or one little motive, one little gesture, and saying, well, I can take this little thing, and I, just by looking at it, I understand what I can develop it into, what kind of mathematical or compositional tricks I can use to work it into a grand kind of unfolding of some kind.
He had a real penchant for making musical structures, right? Just and improvising them all as well, but also kind of knowing how certain materials would play out and how he could spin them out. But I think if I were to say anything in support and defense of Bach, was that he was always willing and sometimes all about throwing a wrench in the works, and that's what I actually like about his. I mean, in a way, it's like maybe his personal joke, right? Like, oh, look at this, everything's perfect, but then I do this, and it suddenly goes on its head, or it doesn't work out the way one would expect, and I think this is because he was, okay, fine and dandy. These are musical devices one can use to compose, and they work out, but he wasn't a slave to them.
I think this comes back really in an interesting way to the book about Bach's dialogues with modernity, because Butt is talking in that book about this this kind of sense of this pre-modern sense of music, the God-given music, and nature having its own God-ordered rules, let's say. And that there's a certain sense of artificiality of mastering nature, and this idea of modernism, that it means progress, that it means humans taking up control over nature, that is present in this very kind of working out that he's doing in his music. Because he's saying, I take this motive from nature or whatever, and I can improve on it into a big fugue or into some bit of neat counterpoint or some sort of canon or whatever it is, right? He can say, oh, I take the simple harmonic progression for my aria in the Goldberg Variations, and I can build this huge thing out of it. This is like an attitude which is subjective in the sense that you say, oh, I see nature, I see the natural material that I'm given, and I can improve on it, right? I, the individual, have the opportunity and the knowledge and the talent that I can go out and improve on things in the world.
But he's also very economical, right? That's it's like an interest in having these very succinct musical materials that you can expand in a way that are applied quite rationally. And I think this has to do also with the sort of rise of scientific thought as well. I mean, it's the same idea in a way of having a theory that explains gravity or something like that. That's very can be reduced to, let's say, a line of a mathematical equation or something like that. Do you understand what I'm sort of implying?
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at, and this is sort of comes back to one of these criticisms, constant criticisms of Bach, right? About him being too mathematical and too scientific or too objective or whatever, or what. I mean, Albert Schweitzer in his big book on Bach talks about how he's an objective composer and never puts his individuality before the substance or whatever. But I think what makes his music so intriguing, and continues to make his music so intriguing for so many musicians and listeners, is that in a sense it's both. There's a kind of unity of both of these worlds in one person's work, if you see what I mean. Butt talks about it as like an element of the pre-modern in the modern. So somehow there's this kind of mathematical working out of things, which makes it a very subjective enterprise of saying, yes, I am the individual and I can take the material of clay and I can mold it into, some incredible thing. And then on the other hand, there's this amazing unity about the fact that one little progression of chords turns into like almost an hour of incredible piano variations. I should say keyboard variations.
Mm-hmm. You should actually.
What comes out of that is this sort of the fact that the work itself is so unified and so coherent that it also has this kind of naturalism about it. This feeling of objectivity, of
growing.
Of a unity of the whole, of organicism, I guess, which also relates it to this kind of feeling of the music of the spheres or the natural order of things or whatever it was that is sort of the medieval side from which I guess Bach grew out into this more modern thing. And there's some kind of unity of those two things that I think is what makes his music so important and so appealing.
Can we just go around the board here and Justin, what's your favorite piece by Bach?
This is not an easy question. We'll have to go back with the chaconne.
And why the chaconne?
He's trying to do something on the instrument that doesn't seem possible. I mean, there's great lines, but it's like he's writing for a keyboard instrument. He's I don't know. It's just things go away and they come back, but you know that they're coming back, and everything is connected on a long scale.
It's a similar structure to the Goldberg Variations because you have this chaconne, which means it's just a bass line which repeats over and over again. So there's like this harmonic grounding on which all of this variation material is built in that piece.
Okay, Emlyn.
I mean, my favorite piece by Bach, if it hasn't been obvious up till now, is the Goldberg Variations.
Okay, yeah. I in doing this preparing for this podcast, I didn't just listen to the Goldberg Variations and or the Art of Fugue, but I gotta admit I really like the Brandenburg Concerti.
They are wonderful.
like it's hard to compare the Brandenburg concertos with something like the Goldberg Variations, because there's for such a different instrumentation and setting, and but I think there's a certain element of I'm interested in the Brandenburg concerto because it's Bach being an extrovert, and the Goldberg Variations is definitely Bach being an introvert.
I don't agree with that point of view at all, actually. Because I think in the Goldberg Variations there's some very virtuosic and outgoing sort of writing. So,
But shouldn't we mention why he was told to write the Goldberg Variations?
yeah, I should read the origin story. It's not. I mean, nobody knows for sure if this is true, but this is from Johann Forkel's early Bach biography. I can just read you the quote right here. He said, this is one of the first biographies of Bach, written shortly after his death. He said,
"For this work, we have to thank the instigation of the former Russian ambassador to the Electoral Court of Saxony, Count Kaiserling, who often stopped in Leipzig and brought there with him the aforementioned Goldberg, in order to have him given musical instruction by Bach." This Goldberg was a servant, I think, of Count Kaiserling's. Anyways, the Count was often ill and had sleepless nights. At such times, Goldberg, who lived in his house, had to spend the night in an antechamber so as to play for him during his insomnia. Once the Count mentioned in Bach's presence that he would like to have some clavier pieces for Goldberg, which should be of such a smooth and somewhat lively character that he might be a little cheered up by them in his sleepless nights. Bach thought himself best able to fulfill this wish by means of variations, the writing of which he had until then considered an ungrateful task on account of their repeatedly similar harmonic foundation. But since at this time all his works were already models of art, such also these variations became under his hands, yet he produced only a single work of this kind. Thereafter the Count always called them his variations. He never tired of them, and for a long time sleepless nights meant, "Dear Goldberg, do play me one of my variations."
so that's the origins.
Did he, I wonder if he played them in order.
That's a good point. I mean,
I would expect that a Count would just be like, he would just be like, "I want number 6 tonight. This is my favorite."
the interesting thing about this is that Goldberg is supposed to have been something like 10 or 12 years old at the time.
Oh, wow.
These variations. So that's one of the questionable things about Forkel's story. But anyways, he must have been some accomplished piano keyboard virtuoso, excuse my French.
Can I go back to the Brandenburg just for 1 second? Because we were uncertain as to if Bach was hearing a lot of music. He was well known for walking long distances to go to concerts. This was a huge thing for him.
You know, that's one of the interesting things we didn't talk about when we talked about Bach's biography, about how he moved from Eisenach to Lüneburg and to Arnstadt, Weimar, and so on. He actually most likely traveled on foot all of those distances in his lifetime. Wow. I mean, it's incredible. It's like days and days of walking on foot, because Lüneburg, if you know where that is, that's near Hamburg in the north of Germany. And where he's from is in eastern central Germany. So that's, I don't know, it's hundreds of kilometers.
Yeah. He walked about like 200 kilometers or something to study with Buxtehude, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, everything on foot. And yeah, it's true. He was known to walk hundreds of kilometers to hear somebody play or to hear a performance of some work. I mean, you can imagine life before the internet, before the compact disc, before the LP, the radio. That was how you heard music. And of course, we didn't talk about the fact that he was probably a serious coffee addict.
Ah, yes.
Because the Brandenburg concertos, probably he played them most likely, among other instrumental pieces, with the Collegium Musicum in Leipzig. They used to go to that cafe there.
And they sound pretty caffeinated.
They do.
Absolutely. I mean, lots of his music sounds pretty caffeinated. Let's think about the Italian concerto. And probably somebody who had whatever, he had 10 children and had to write a cantata for the church service every week.
He had more than 10, right?
Or 20
He had
children,
20.
right? You see, I'm not even up to date on how many children he had. 20 children.
It's like 22 or something, and 16 survived. No, we got to get that right. But
We do have to get that right, but I believe it was 20.
So imagine a guy who has like 20 children. He has 3 choirs that he has to conduct. He has to write a new cantata every week for the church. He has to rehearse with the students at the university. He has to teach singing lessons. And he's composing all this music on the side, and he's playing the organ. I think the only way he managed was through copious caffeine consumption.
The number is 20 children, but only 9 of them survived him. That means 9 of them outlived him. So some of them probably made it past childhood, but...
I mean, it's Johann Friedman and Carl Philipp Emanuel who became well known as composers in their own right after Bach's death.
And so a lot of what we know about Bach is actually written by his children, because they were at least a little bit better than him in writing down things.
You know, we should talk about this Code le Bête, which is the last variation before the aria comes back in the Goldberg Variations.
It sounds very lyrical. It sounds very almost like it's written for voice.
It shows sort of the fun side of the guy, because it's based on multiple German folk songs, and the idea of this Code le Bête, Forkel also explains this in his Bach biography, is he says that it was a custom observed at Bach's family reunions, because all of his relatives were musicians, and they would get together and they would start singing. And they would start, singing some chorale or some religious song, and then they would start joking around by singing popular songs all at the same time, mixed together. So this is what he essentially did when he wrote that last variation in the Goldbergs, is that he put a kind of, what did he do? He put 2 popular songs which can be identified in there. One of which is, I have so long been away from you, come closer. And the other one is, cabbage and turnips have driven me away. Had my mother cooked meat, I'd have opted to stay.
Catchy lyrics.
And this probably sounds better in German.
It certainly does. I guess it's supposed to resemble sort of a Bach family reunion, where everyone strikes up a chorale and other people start singing rude popular songs in the middle of it. It's sort of a funny way of thumbing your nose at the entire work you've just conceived, when you've written, 29 of these incredible canons, and I don't know what,
Yeah, but that's my point again about Bach being like a prankster with his own kind of methodology about how to compose and how to shape things and organize music. And then he would just be like, but, and I think that's actually really charming. And the more you dig into Bach, the more you see examples of that.
He was a human after all. He was a human after all. He was a human after all.
And I think that's important to remember.
He was a human after all.
And I think that's important to remember.
I think it's very important.